Welcome to Hub Dialogues. I'm your host, Harrison Lowman, managing editor of the Hub. There is a deepening malaise affecting modern men. Economists are tracking drops in male participation in the labor force. The unemployment rate is now 16.2% for young men. Teachers are seeing women outperform men at school, with men now only making up 42% of Canadian university undergrads. City workers are watching as nearly 70% of those entering shelters are men. Public health officials are tracking as men become 3 times more likely than women to take their own lives through deaths of despair. Read suicide, where men are 3 times more likely to kill themselves than women, and addiction, where men account for 73% of opioid deaths. Many men, many young men, are feeling lost and forgotten by their countries. For more on that, I'm joined by Jamil Jivani. He's the Conservative MP for Bowmanville-Oshawa North. He's the author of Why Young Men, Rage, Race, and the Crisis of Identity. And Jamil launched a project called Restore the North to highlight the issues young men are facing across this country. Jamil, thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thanks. So let's get into this. Just overall, overarching, would you say that young men are in crisis in this country right now?
I believe so. And, you mentioned some of the issues that young men across Canada are facing. If you look at other metrics, unemployment, you look at things related to men's mental health, you look at what's happening in the justice system, where a lot of men in desperate situations are committing crimes and the crime rate is going up. We see a lot of reason to believe that young men across this country are not getting the attention they deserve from policymakers. And we also see that these problems have a ripple effect on everybody. When I talk about young men, one of the first responses I get is this sense of, well, what about everyone else? And I don't believe this is an either or thing, but I do believe if you want to solve problems, you've got to be precise. And when we see the unemployment rate for young men being so much worse than most other demographics in the country, for example, that does require an honest conversation. And I do believe that the liberal framework that is producing most public policy in this country right now is a framework in which young men have been lost and marginalized. And I am working as hard as I can as a member of parliament to remind young men that they are not forgotten, that there are people in the political system who want to talk about their experiences and want to offer solutions to the problems they're facing.
So it's institutional, it's cultural. Let's start with the institutional side of things, because in the words you've put out, you point your finger at government largely. Why, you say in your speech, to these men, it's not your fault. Why, in many ways, is it the government's fault in your mind?
Well, I believe that personal responsibility is important. And you look at the rise of someone like Dr. Jordan Peterson, who offered that personal responsibility message that resonated with so many young men across Canada and around the world. But I do believe in order to deliver that message, we also have to make sure the environment is there for personal responsibility to equate to success. And when you look at the policy landscape of Canada right now, you see so many barriers to success for young people across the board. And those barriers are uniquely affecting young men. The ability to afford a home, the ability to get a job, the ability to go to school and be positioned well for success in the economy. While personal responsibility can help with all of those things, ultimately a government has to create the right conditions for success. And when I say to young men, it's not your fault, it's reminding us that we have a lot of work to do collectively.
Why do you think young men across the world are gravitating towards parties on the right these days?
Well, to the extent that's happening, I think it's for 2 primary reasons. Number one, it is a countercultural movement now to be conservative. Liberal ideology has been so deeply embedded in so many institutions that young people who are hungry for change are looking for a different way to respond to their circumstances. And conservative parties or center-right political parties offer something different than what is being offered to a lot of young people right now through the education system, through universities, through mainstream media. The other main reason is we are offering a reminder of how the economy can work, but does not work. And what I mean by that is an economy where people are able to live up to their potential. I think there's a long time where young people heard a lot of conservative economic policy as wanting to abandon responsibility for social problems. But now we're at a point where the economy has gotten so difficult for people that they realize an economy where you are free to be successful, where private enterprise can thrive, where job rates are moving in a positive direction, not a negative direction. This is a message of personal empowerment because we don't want young people or anyone to be dependent on the government. We want people to be able to make their own choices and live their own lives. And I think that message resonates when a lot of young people look at their society and say, I'm working hard, I'm doing everything I've been told, but I can't get ahead.
I note I was surprised by Student Vote Canada, which allows elementary, intermediate, and high school students to vote across the country. When they did their vote around the last election, they voted in a conservative government. But pursuing those voters, Jamil, does it come at the expense of, you know, getting boomer voters? When you make housing more affordable, that nest egg that a 70 plus person has in Rosedale here in Toronto, is it, do you lose their vote while trying to gain that young person's vote ever?
You know, one, I do think that part of the conservative movement's appeal to boomers and to seniors right now is to say, let's think about the future of our country.
Mm.
And I do think a lot of seniors respond well to our efforts to explain that we need to have a housing market where young people can move out of their parents' basements and start a family. So that's part of our message, is showing how the generations are connected together. But I do believe that, we have a change message right now. And certainly for people who are comfortable in our economy today, that change message is going to sound differently than people who are not comfortable in our economy. But ultimately, in order to, not just win elections, but to govern well, you want to have as many people in your society seeing their futures tied together as possible, so that we really do live up to the idea of being our brother or sister's keeper. And I hope that that is what we're able to achieve when we lay out this vision for how we help young men, that we're all in this together, and that when part of our community is struggling, we've got to all care about that.
Let's talk about some of that struggling. So we talked about the institutional side of things. Let's look at the cultural side. Caitlin Morin, who's a feminist journalist and author of a book, What About Men? She actually did a monk debate here in Toronto years ago, arguing for the end of men. But she had a wake-up call a few years ago when she was speaking to 4 boys from her daughter's school on International Women's Day. She speaks to them, and these kids say, one boy says, men are just seen as bad or toxic. We're blamed for everything. People just automatically presume we're all rapists. I was blown away by this line, young boy saying this. What do you make of this idea, or the culture that would produce this feeling of shame for being a young man today?
Yeah, that's real heartbreaking to hear a young person feel that way about himself. I think part of this is a result of a mentality that, you can sort of create a hierarchy of human identities. And this is really accelerated in recent years. This idea that based on your race or your gender or other characteristics each person may have, that some of us are privileged or unprivileged, and therefore you can talk about them and their identities in different ways. To give you an example of what I mean, I'm a Black man. My father is an immigrant to Canada from Kenya. I'm also a Christian. I'm also a Canadian. I have lots of identities, just like everybody in our country does. And I feel that there are certain parts of my identity where people will talk about it with more sensitivity and respect than others. And I don't think that's right. I think all of us are owed a certain sense of respect, a certain sense of nuance to understand where we come from. But that gets lost when you take a very rigid view that some people in a society are oppressed and some people are oppressors, and your moral obligation to people changes based on what they look like or where they come from. This is one of the reasons why I've been such a strong advocate to dismantle things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. People hear that and they often think this is some kind of political culture war stuff. Or they ask me, well, as a Black man, how could you advocate for this? And I say it's because I believe in universal morality. I believe that we treat everybody the same. And I'm more inclined for policies that respond to people struggling, regardless of what they look like, than I am to policies that assign certain value based on what you look like or where you come from. So that boy you're talking about who feels that way, I believe that's a reflection that in our culture it became normal, and I'm working hard to change this, to speak about men and to speak about boys in a way that did not acknowledge their humanity and the complexities of their experiences.
How do you explain to folks that in doing this, it doesn't come at the expense of women? If anything, it serves them in that it's creating better men that will then interact with women. How do you go about sort of getting people to wrap their heads around that?
Yeah, well, you nailed it. I mean, we're sort of all in this together, and we certainly everybody affects one another. We share communities, we share neighborhoods, we share a country. One of the things I try to stress is that we have been able to make these acknowledgments in some areas. So to give you an example of what I mean, Harrison, when we talk about intimate partner violence and domestic violence, we sort of recognize that part of creating safe communities for women is addressing the behaviors of men and the issues that they're facing. The same is true for, I would argue, for every issue. In every issue, the health of your neighbor, the quality of life of your neighbor is going to have a reflection on your life too. And particularly when we're talking about men and women, I mean, we are quite literally bound together. In order to create more human beings, we need to be able to live together harmoniously and depend on one another and be happy together. And if you see these huge disparities, which we currently see in our country, where young men are facing issues like addiction, homelessness, mental health issues, unemployment in such a big way, I think we should all be able to say, like, yeah, this kind of affects everyone. And I would say this is one area where I always like to remind people that every time I talk about young men publicly, whether it's when I wrote my book or now as a member of parliament, I get a tremendous amount of positive feedback from women, from women who are moms, sisters, friends, women who see how this stuff affects everybody. So I always like to keep that perspective because there is a tendency to take these conversations about men and want to turn it into something divisive. I don't think it is that way, and I don't think most Canadians believe it is that way. And I do believe that in many cases, when we get that response, it's not in earnest because any objective evaluation of this would indicate that we all have something to gain and lose by the health of the young men in our communities.
How should projects like these exist beside the feminist project? You look at that young boy we were just talking about, and Miss Moran talks about a young boy like him, 15 years old. His entire life, he's been going to school and where he's told, girls should feel confident. There's a feminist club at the school, and that, well, maybe for that kid's grandfather or father, the last few years have been, a new correction for what has otherwise been what they would call patriarchy. For this kid who's 15 years old, he's been inundated with messages solely that, like, you should feel proud if you're a young girl, but not if you're a young boy.
Yeah, well, I mean, feminism is one of those words that kind of means different things to each person you ask. So there are, I'm certain versions of feminist organizations and associations of students that could be very healthy, and maybe that particular one wasn't. But in my view, a lot of how we produce, healthy, strong young people comes down to positive and effective role modeling. Right. I know, Harrison, you've written about, Boy Scouts, for example, and that's a great example of where you can have these associations focused on gender. They can be for boys or they can be for girls, but by role modeling, you produce healthy examples for what young people aspire to be, and surround them with positive influences. And to me, it sounds like that the boys' experience at that school was lacking that. It was not about the positive influences for men or for women. It seemed more about the critical discourse about one another, or in particular for his case, critical discourse about boys and men. I don't think that's helpful for anybody. And this is part of why I always push back on language like toxic masculinity. People try to nuance these things, and maybe if you have a graduate degree, it might be easy for you to capture the nuance. But for that 15-year-old boy, when you speak about his identity in that way and expect him to feel it with nuance, I don't think that's fair. And if we're doing this type of work because we believe in young people and the next generation of our country, we should anchor our words and our deeds in what we believe is best to encourage the most positive form of each and every young person.
And I encourage people to look into scouting. I've been a scout leader for 5 or so years now, and involved in that movement for, I don't know, 30 years or so. And it is a place, like, can you go about describe first? Let's look at the paths. A dark path that men go down and a light path. The light path involves them being able to find that acceptance that they crave, a sense of belonging, etc. Maybe joining brothers and sisters clubs, scouting, etc. But in terms of that dark path, where are young men in Canada sort of finding that acceptance where they probably shouldn't? Like, what are the groups you describe there?
I think role modeling is actually an important concept for explaining both the positive and negative behaviors that boys and young men adopt. And this is true for all people. When you look at these young men, for example, who get caught up in the justice system, you will find that in many cases they were lost. They found inspiration in the wrong places. They met older men who were criminals, or they had a peer group who influenced them to adopt antisocial behavior. And they were chasing acceptance in a social network where that social network was based on destructive behavior. Similarly, if you see a young man who has adopted a positive life, who's gone on to go to school and get a job and make meaningful contributions to society, often it's a very similar story, but in the positive direction. They sought role models and they found them in good places. Maybe it was their father at home. Maybe it was a teacher, a coach. Maybe it was someone in the Boy Scouts. Maybe it was someone from the Big Brothers program. And you'll find that part of their story and their evolution is responding to a desire to be part of a positive social network. And that is where they learn how to be a great contributor to society. So this is really the fork in the road that a lot of young men face. And one of the reasons why I'm a big advocate for fatherhood and valuing fathers in society is I fundamentally believe fathers can have one of the most important roles in influencing the type of role models that young men will seek to find. If you have a father in the home who shows you the right way, encourages you in the right way, believes in you when you need someone to believe in you, you have a much higher likelihood of finding a positive place. But where you don't have a dad in the home, or maybe you don't have a good relationship with your father, and I say that with no judgment because I was in that position growing up, you can easily wind up in a scenario where it's like having a compass that has no North Star. You're looking in the wrong places and you can find the wrong places. So I spend a lot of time understanding the stories of young men, wanting to hear them in a non-judgmental way, because I want them to know that you can come from tough places, you can make mistakes, you can go down the wrong road at some point in your life, but there's always a positive place if you want it. And I think of myself as an example of that. There are many of them across Canada, and we want to remind as many young men as possible that a brighter days are ahead and not to give up on yourself.
Jamil, in terms of going down that road, and you've studied this, what causes young men to jump from, feeling hurt, feeling down on their luck, and then jumping towards violence, like actually committing violence, whether it's, joining ISIS, joining a gang? what causes that jump to occur?
Yeah, that's complicated for sure, and I've tried my best to understand it, as well as any one person can. From speaking to a lot of young men in different situations over the last decade, what I've been able to piece together is that often what occurs is in places of instability, whether that's mental instability, economic instability, something happens that is very disruptive in a young man's life. And often the response to that can swing in very wild directions. In the wrong place in the wrong time with the wrong person whispering in your ear, a moment of desperation can turn into something very harmful for society. One of the ways that often manifests itself is through resentment. And this is one thing that's really important for people to keep in mind. We have to ensure that young people are not conditioned to resent others, especially for immutable characteristics, to blame people based on race, religion, ethnicity, national origin, you name it, to associate identity groups with problems. And even in the context of gang violence that you might find in a city like Toronto or Chicago, you will find that resentment can take form of a neighborhood or a competing gang. But this idea that young men are taught to hate and process their struggles through blaming others, that is an issue. And so, one of the reasons why I think it's important to talk about the politics of this and the policy of this is to remind people that these things can change. It's not about blaming somebody and saying, well, this one group of people is responsible for all of my sorrows. It's about saying, hey, we're in a democracy. You've got the ability to help shape the future. Don't be hopeless about it. Get involved and try to make this as good of a place as it possibly can be. And I think that's part of what we try to do is show people there's healthy ways to respond to your struggles and not to get lost in this sense of resenting others or being hateful toward anybody.
How should we consider in the last few days, Jamil? We've had two young men kill, whether they be in Manchester, horrible attack on a synagogue the other day, or the assassination of Charlie Kirk by a 22-year-old who picked up a gun. I don't want to have really any sympathy for these people, and a lot of people don't. I remember Justin Trudeau years ago talking about root causes after a recent attack. How should we, as concerned members of Canadian society, be sorting through those acts and the people behind them?
Well, first off, the justice system has to punish people for crimes and punish people for harming others. When there's a murder or some kind of vile crime like that, you need a system that's going to throw the book at an offender.
Yeah.
And I have no problem with saying that the justice system needs to be harder on criminals, whether they're young men, older men, women, you name it. We need a stronger hammer of justice in this country for sure. And in the situations in other countries that you described, I think that's a completely fair response is very strong law enforcement. However, what we're talking about here is how do we avoid those situations? Once a situation becomes that extreme, I think it can be very difficult to figure out a non-criminal justice response.
Mm.
But where we see young men struggling and we can offer them something positive before it gets that bad, that's where I'm trying to spend my time at the moment, right? Because I don't think every young man in prison needed to be in prison. I think you could have tried to help some of these people make changes before it got that bad. And to give you an example of what I mean, one of my colleagues, conservative MP Luc Berthold, he introduced a bill that would allow youth courts to provide drug treatment options to adolescent offenders. And that's the kind of stuff I mean when I say, can we get people the help they need before it gets worse, before it gets to an extreme position? Not saying that in the cases you mentioned necessarily drugs were involved, but it's a good example of where when the justice system initially interacts with a young person who is going through a lot of negativity, are we doing everything we can to make sure that negativity turns around? And I think that's where our efforts could produce some positive results.
Just a few more questions for you. One of them being a place that media, which overwhelmingly leans left, describes what is, and I'm interested how you would label it, a manosphere, far right manosphere that only makes these men's lives worse. I'm wondering how you go about labeling what that place is, and why men gravitate towards it, what it provides them, both bad and good.
Yeah, I mean, those terms like manosphere, I think, encompass a lot of different stuff. So I'll make a distinction on what I think is valuable. There are people who create online content, primarily on YouTube, but also other places, that seek to empower men with positivity and an affirming, uplifting message. That can be good. Where it becomes a problem is when some of these online influencers speak about women in a way that is as offensive or troublesome as you might find some of the toxic masculinity discourse is about boys and young men. And to me, that's the distinction that's really important to make. If you look at someone like Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, we have plenty of influential examples of men online who have connected with young men with a positive, affirming message. They're responsible with their words. They provide strong experienced voice for young men who are going through different challenges and are seeking, examples for what they can learn from. But then you also have a whole host of other content where it's actually more, it seems to me, about being anti-woman than it is about being positive about men. And that's the distinction that I think is important. When you look at mainstream media, I don't think they're making that distinction very well. And that would be my main point of disagreement with them. Are some, people who they might regard in the manosphere negative? Sure. But they often take these labels, apply it to way too many people, and make it way too broad of a category, to the point where you would find organizations in the mainstream media who trash Joe Rogan as if he's a problem. And in my view, he's actually a very positive influence on a lot of people, gets them working out, talks about his own family, his children that he raises, is into sports, is curious, intellectual. Labeling someone like that in a negative way, I don't really see how that gets us anywhere.
They should be launching more criticism toward the Andrew Tates of the world, right?
Yeah, I mean, Andrew Tate would be an example of someone who is quite irresponsible and reckless with his words. And I'm sure there were people who could find a video clip of him saying something positive about young men, but there's also a lot of video clips of him saying horrible things about women. He's been indicted, for crimes that are, horrible. He would be an example of someone that you don't want to point to and say, "Hey, young man, look him up on YouTube and see him as a role model." That's not the case. But as I said, mainstream media makes a lot of mistakes, I think, in their ability to distinguish what you might not like from what is bad. And a reporter might not like Joe Rogan, but he's not bad. And I think that's an important line to maintain.
One of the things I'm worried about, Jamil, is not that, it's not that men are gravitating towards the right or the left. It's not an ideological thing. I interact with a lot of young people, and what I see is growing nihilism. They are confronted by some of the stats you just described, whether it's, will I ever get married? Will I ever own a home? And then they start asking larger questions, and they start saying, what the heck's the point of all this anyways? And then they start getting rebellious, and then they become nihilistic. I'm wondering if this is a trend you're seeing growing among young people in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very worried about that. I really am, because I hear those stories. I have people reach out to me. Sometimes it is young men themselves, sometimes it's their parents or their friends who share these stories with me all the time. And it makes me really sad, to be honest, because the idea that any person could think, especially at a young age, that they already know what's possible for their own lives is heartbreaking. You want young people to feel like life is an adventure, and that the more you put into it, the more you're going to get out of it. And that sense of purpose is lacking right now. And I really do worry about the habits that form if that's your mentality, the effort you will not put into your own life, the opportunities you will not take if that's how you think. It's very sad to me to think about. So for me, it's really important that we try to push back on that. And sometimes that means being very direct, like I try to say to young men, don't take the path of watching pornography and playing video games and sort of putting your life in this passive mode. Work and dream and fight for your future and hold people like me accountable to making sure that we're creating the conditions for you to succeed. But if you check out of the process, if you don't vote when you have the chance to, and you don't explore that opportunity when it presents itself, and you don't start that business, and you don't get that degree, and you don't learn that skill, now you're putting yourself in a position where you're letting the world say it doesn't need to serve your interests the way it might serve everyone else's. And I want young men to feel like you are entitled to being a healthy, equal participant in this country. You have an equal stake in its future. And we want as many young people as possible to feel that way every day.
So I became a dad about 14 days ago. I'll reveal that
Hey,
here.
congratulations.
Thank you. And as we look towards solutions, getting a bit more positive here just at the end, what are those solutions, Jamil, in terms of mentorship, in terms of places in our Canadian community where, men can gravitate towards to actually plot that light towards the light, not the darkness, to plot that path ahead of them? What should they be looking at?
Yeah, I mean, the most kind of general, I suppose, like advice I could offer to any young man who's watching this is build relationships. Don't isolate yourself. Don't think you're the only one going through whatever's in front of you today. Build relationships, be active, be out there. It can be difficult to build a community. But there's way more opportunity to build those relationships than you think. That could be through a formal organization, something like a mentorship program. It could be going to church or synagogue or mosque or whatever your cultural background is. It could be through school. It could be through sports. But build those relationships. What I think a root cause, just to maybe borrow a phrase you used earlier, for a lot of the challenges that young men face is a feeling of isolation and a feeling that nobody has your back. And I just want to really get across to as many people as possible, build those relationships. And if you are in a position of strength where you're doing well in society, you've got a career, go reach out to others who are not in that same position. You can be the one who extends that olive branch and wants to be around people who need reminders that life is going to get better. And I think if we all take on that responsibility, we can make a lot of the change we're talking about in our own local communities, in our day-to-day life. As for the political side of this, the policy side of it, we have to make it normal to talk about this stuff. I really believe that. And regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, I'm a conservative. I obviously have some strong critiques of what liberals have done in our country over the last decade. But I care about you regardless of who you vote for.
You care about young liberal men.
Yeah. I do. Every young liberal man watching this, every young socialist man watching this,
Wow.
I care about you very much. And if I can help you, and if you have policy ideas for how we can make things better, I don't want you to feel like my door is closed for you either. So get in touch with us. My contact information is very easily available. And, this is why, Harrison, we're doing our campus tour. We launch it on October 14th. I'm going to as many campuses as I can, and I want to hear from everybody. I'm not going to ask who you voted for, but I want to know what you think we need to do to get the future of this country in order.
Beautiful. That's Jamil Jivani. He is the Conservative MP for Bowmanville-Oshawa North. His project is called Restore the North. It's meant to highlight the issues young men are facing in this country. And we thank him so much for joining us on Hub Dialogues today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Jamil. And ladies and gentlemen, if you want to check out more reporting on culture, politics, business, and all of the above, you can go on www.thehub.ca and why not become a subscriber to go see some exclusive content. We'd love to have you. This video is brought to you by Airbnb. This month, Airbnb is a sponsor of the Hub's YouTube channel. Governments are rightly focused on addressing Canada's housing crisis, but when they spend time restricting short-term rentals like Airbnb, they're not focused on what's most important. According to Statistics Canada, the number of short-term rentals that could potentially become long-term homes amounts to only 0.6% of Canada's housing stock. Canada needs almost 6 million new homes by 2030 to achieve affordability, and a closer look clearly shows that building more housing, not restricting short-term rentals, is the only real solution. To learn more, go to airbnb.ca.